guys are listening to and perhaps even watching the Confronting Christianity podcast. I say this because this is the first time that we are doing full video, done, clips and things up to this point. But as of season 7, which starts today, you guys can watch the podcast as well. And I'm here with my friend Karen Swallow Pryor. Karen, I'm always slightly jealous of your name. Like, Swallow Pryor is just really cool. I wish I had a cool middle name or second middle last name.
Maiden name. It's very traditional. It's very 19th century of me to take my last name and make it a middle name, like Harriet Beecher Stowe and all of the other.
Yeah. Oh, maybe I should go by Rebecca Beale McLaughlin, but I'm not. Anyway, Karen, for those who don't know her, is the award-winning author of On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books, and The Evangelical Imagination, How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. She's a frequent speaker, a monthly columnist at Religion News Service, and has written for Christianity Today, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Vox. She's a research fellow with Comment, a founding member of the Pelican Project, a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, and a senior fellow at the International Alliance for Christian Education. And this year, 2025 to 26, Karen is also the Carlson Scholar at Bethel Seminary. Karen, I always enjoy our conversations. But today, I'm particularly wanting to talk to you about the topic of your latest book, which I'm waving for those who are watching us, which is titled, You Have a Calling, Finding Your Vocation in the True, Good, and Beautiful. Karen, my guess is that everyone who is listening to us, regardless of how they would identify religiously, and I know we have a whole range of people from those who'd see themselves as serious Christians to those who aren't sure that they believe in God at all and sort of everything in between. My guess is that all of us would love to feel like our lives have a purpose in general, and that perhaps even our kind of working lives, conceived very broadly, have a purpose too. That whether we're religious or not, we probably all would love to feel like we are called to something or we have a vocation in the sort of older language of that term. And the claim of your book is that actually we do. So do you want to give us a little starter on what you mean by this claim that you, a reader of Karen's book, have a calling?
Well, spoiler alert, I actually argue and make this statement pretty early in the book that we have multiple callings over the course of our lives. And I think that's key because we might have this sort of romantic illusion that we have one great calling, or that calling is something that some people have but others don't. But I'm kind of trying to make callings a little bit smaller, really, in a sense, and in that way make them more accessible and dignified to all of us, because the romantic ideas about calling are not so true and not so great. And in fact, the things that we are called to are often things, and most often things, that we don't even choose for ourselves. That's a central thesis of the book, is that a calling comes from outside us, and our passions and desires and talents and skills come from inside. And we do want to try to make them match up. And that's can be part of the process of finding our callings. And yet often we find ourselves called to things and to roles and to places and to people and to tasks that we're not of our own choosing. And yet we can find them and flourish in them and even develop a passion for them after a while.
So break that down for us a bit. You said that a calling comes from outside of us. It's not something that, it's not just sort of what I feel like doing or what I think I would enjoy the most or even what I might be best at, but that it's something more than that. So where does this calling come from, and how can you justify that claim?
In the book, I use the term calling and vocation interchangeably, even though we might use those words differently in different contexts, but they both really come from similar etymology, word histories. And so the word vocation literally means it is a calling, a vocalizing. So someone else vocalizes from outside and calls us, just like, in the old days when we would get a call on the phone instead of a text. We would get the call, or we might get the email from someone inviting us to apply for a job or fulfill a post or fulfill a role or get married or whatever the calling might be. And of course, we do, again, ideally, hopefully, have those callings match up with the gifts and skills that we have, the passions we have. If we were doing a Venn diagram, we would draw circles where they might overlap a little or might overlap a lot. But calling comes from outside, and we have to use wisdom in answering the call, and our passions maybe as guides to whether we should or shouldn't answer the call. But some of the most important callings that we have in life are ones that we don't necessarily choose, such as being a daughter or son to the parents that we are born to or raised by, or being a sibling to our brothers and sisters, being a friend to the people that we encounter in our lives, or being a neighbor to those that we live near. These are actually all callings. They're not all the same. They're not all of the greatest magnitude, but they are things that we are called to from outside of ourselves.
Mm. So my guess is, Karen, you and I both as people who believe not only in sort of a generic idea of a God who made us, but in the very sort of specific idea of who God is revealed in the Bible and particularly in the person of Jesus Christ, that we would say calling comes from God fundamentally.
Right.
And I love your reflections sort of as we're thinking about calling here. One of the things that's come to mind for me is the Apostle Paul's strange calling in the New Testament book of Acts, where, this guy who is initially completely opposed to Christianity, to where he's like actively hunting down Christians to get them arrested and dragged off to prison, even executed, is confronted with Jesus, who turns his life around and then says something along the lines of, I'm going to show Paul how much he must suffer for my name. Like Paul has a very specific calling from God, which is to go and sort of spread the message of Jesus way beyond the Jewish people. But it seems like it's in some ways an undesirable calling because it comes with a whole bunch of suffering. I'm curious whether that, is just sort of unique to Paul as like one particular figure in the Bible story, or whether there's something in there that kind of touches on some of the pieces of calling for all Christians, and the sort of whole idea of calling from a Christian perspective.
Yeah, that's a great example to start out with, because as I say in the book, I have no formulas. I have no 6 steps to finding your calling and fulfilling it. There is no such thing, because we're all so unique, uniquely made, uniquely created, and in unique spaces and places in the world. But sometimes it can look something like what Paul went through. Obviously, he didn't choose this calling and this life of suffering that followed it, and the calling was really the opposite of the direction that he was headed in his life. And sometimes that can happen for us. I mean, there are things, I have said in various contexts over the years that some of the things that I have engaged in and am passionate about, I think the last time I was on this podcast with you, we were talking about abortion and the pro-life movement, which I've been part of for many years. I can tell you, it is not something I would necessarily choose for myself. I didn't sit down one day and say, hey, I want to be an activist in this area. And I feel, a rational reason for it, even though I do. It really is not something that I think necessarily meshes with my personality and my interests. But it does mesh with something about how I'm made and how God called me. And the same is true of just sort of being on social media and standing up for truth. It's the prophetic gift that I think I have, which I didn't choose and don't necessarily want, but I'm trying to lean into that calling. That kind of thing can be true for many of us, that it's not something that we would choose, but it's not always true. So I don't want people to think, oh, if I hate this thing or I'm suffering in this thing, that means I'm called to it. It's not a formula like that, but again, we can look at all of these different kinds of examples and see a little bit more clearly how calling can work in different and mysterious ways. And we just have to use wisdom and discernment and the resources that we have through our communities to help us to understand it if something is what we are called to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Even as you're talking, I'm sort of scrolling through other biblical examples of people who are very specifically called by God and who basically say, I think you've got this wrong. Like, please send somebody else.
Yes,
Whether
yes.
it's Moses in the book of Exodus, who, when God sort of says, I'm sending you to rescue my people from Egypt, Moses is like, listen, you don't understand. I'm terrible at speaking. Like, this is not something I'd be good at all. Surely you can find some, there's sort of whole negotiation Moses goes through trying to convince God that really he should pick somebody else. Or the Old Testament prophet Jonah, who, when God called him to go and preach to a bunch of pagans in a place he didn't want God to be merciful to, just got up and went the opposite direction. Like, it wasn't even, he didn't even just sort of have the conversation initially. He just flat disobeyed.
Right.
And that certainly, I think, within the Christian framework, there is space for that idea of like, oh, you could be quite specifically called to something that is really hard and that you feel utterly inadequate to do.
Right.
And, you would much rather God pick somebody else. You could even give the Lord a list of people who you think would be, much better candidates for this job than you are, and yet you're called to it. And at the same time, the reality from a Christian perspective is that we're not expecting to hear a voice from God telling us to do, to take this job or to move to that place or to engage in this kind of act. Like, that can happen, but that it's actually relatively rare, I think, to have that level of specific sort of revelation about our lives. So Karen, you said you don't have a sort of 5-step, way to discern your calling in your book, where you're claiming that everybody has a calling. So how might somebody go about discerning what their calling is if they are a follower of Jesus and they're thinking, I want to figure out what it is that I'm meant to be doing with my life, of all the various good things that I could be doing with my life?
Right. Because, one of the things in sort of answering that question, I want to give some counter examples to those who are running away from the call that God has given them. We have the opposite trend in our culture today, which is to run towards something that we see other people doing, that we think, oh, I would like to do that. I want to do that. So I must be called to do that. And yet the calls don't come, right? The calling from outside doesn't come. And so we can ping pong back and forth between the examples that we have in front of us of oh, I must be called to do this because God is punishing me, or I must be called to do this because I see this person on social media doing this thing and that looks fun and cool and I would like to have that life as well. Those are two extreme examples, and the reality of finding our calling is, and this we'll talk about more later, but the short answer is pursuing the true, good, and beautiful, which is the second half of the book. But before we can even, focus on those, we really have to be in community. We have to be trying things. We have to be, to use the sort of stale cliche, but it's a true one. It's like kind of going through the doors, seeing what doors open, seeing, learning about ourselves. This is part of the true part. The truth part is knowing the truth about ourselves and knowing the truth about the reality of the work itself. Because again, we can be presented with so many false images of what work and calling look like and how someone else is thriving in that. And so we think that must be what we're supposed to do, when it may be that there are different truths about how we're made and the reality of our lives that we have to pay attention to in order to discover whether this thing that we see someone else is doing is necessarily a calling for us. So, it's really starting with the truth about who we are, where we are, what we're equipped to do, what the needs of the world are in the moment, and what the needs of the world are where we are, and trying things out and seeing if we do get the call.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's always sort of lingered in my mind from reading through the gospel accounts of Jesus's life and the conversations that he has with his disciples is how often Jesus has to remind them that the way that human beings instinctively think about power, status, prestige, the kinds of things that we might aspire to have in the sort of worldly sense are actually not the things that followers of Jesus should be pursuing. And I'm sort of thinking about that in relation to this idea of calling and how it's easy to see people who maybe, have a public ministry or a famous for their expertise or for their talents or for their sort of sporting prowess or whatever, and it's sort of everybody wanting to be that thing.
Mhm.
And how Jesus, he has to sit down his disciples who've just really embarrassingly been arguing about which of them is the greatest, and explain to them that in his kingdom, the people at the very bottom are in fact the most, you should be sort of scrambling to the bottom rather than scrambling to the top, because even Jesus didn't come to be served but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And I'm curious for your thoughts on how that sort of upside down view of status and what God values,
Mm.
how that informs a genuinely Christian sort of understanding of calling and vocation versus one that's sort of maybe, we're going to put a little Christian sprinkle over the top of it, but it's fundamentally exactly what anybody else who doesn't know the call of Jesus might aspire to, in some sort of public role or earning a lot of money or having things that will gain you status in the eyes of other people.
Mm. I mean, the calling of Jesus and the way that he articulates it and models it in the New Testament is very much at the root of what I'm talking about in this book. And I also, in writing this book, I'm writing in a very particular cultural moment. I mean, there are lots of books on vocation and calling out there. I mean, it was a big topic in the Protestant Reformation a few hundred years ago. Luther was writing about it, and lots of people since then have written about it. So I am writing for a particular audience prompted by some particular cultural excesses of our time. And one of them is, especially in having spent over 2 decades teaching college age students, is this mistaken idea, often promoted in the church, but let's be honest, often promoted, in the culture at large as well, that we're all supposed to do big, glamorous, dramatic things. And some people certainly will do those things. But there's a sense that I have gained from having countless conversations with not just younger people, but older people too, that if they have not been doing big, glamorous, world-changing things, like on the surface world-changing, then they have failed and they haven't found their calling. And that is so not true on its face, but also not true in terms of the economy and the vocation portrayed and modeled by Jesus. Right. And then on the other hand, we have people, striving to do these big things, dramatic things, because they think that's what they're supposed to do. But then on the other end of life, toward midlife or later in life, which I am, we can have people, and I've had countless of these conversations too. For example, women who have stayed home and raised their children, and now their children are leaving the nest or have left the nest, and they're looking back and saying, wait, what did I do with my life? Did I miss my calling? Because I didn't do something extraordinary that everyone knows about or is writing about or talking about. And that is a lie from the pit of hell as well, that someone who has spent their life doing faithful, ordinary things in the life, nurturing the lives of children or the lives of spouses or family members, that is a great calling. Their calling can take so many different forms. But we live in a culture, in a particular moment in which, because we're inundated with images from social media and headlines and news, that we think the splashier something is, or the more headlines it grabs, or the more YouTube views it gets or clicks it gets, the greater it is. And that is just not true about calling at all. And that's one of the great truths that I wanted to communicate in this book.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely spot on, and that especially in our particular kind of corner of the modern world, that I
Right.
think we're all raised with this idea, and we're raising the next generation with this idea that your life needs to be something worth a Wikipedia page at least, sort of something that's going to sort of stand out from the masses of others in a way that's not particularly well aligned with the vision that Jesus has. I'm curious, as a sort of side note there, and you and I obviously both women who've been kind of navigating what it means to have a calling, as somebody who's female, which is going to have some different inflections than our brothers in Christ. And I'm curious for your thoughts on like the overcorrection that can happen in the other way of people saying, oh, well, if you are a wife and mother, that is your sole call, that's your entire calling. And, once you've raised your children, if you have them, then you can just sort of put your feet up, watch TV for the rest of your life because, job done. Like your kind of Christian mission is accomplished. And now is the time to sort of wait until you die, essentially, sort of in a comfortable way. I'm guessing that you, like me, don't think that that's the call of the Bible either. But I'm sort of curious for your thoughts on how to reframe that overcorrection.
Yeah, and it's good to frame it as an overcorrection because it is that, and those roles that we have in family. Again, our choices are involved in them most of the time or some of the time. But the example that I use in the book is, yes, I am married, and I love being married, but I always wanted children and did not have them. So that was not a calling that I had. And we have so many single brothers and sisters who want to be married and just have not received the call to be married. And so there is no cookie cutter formula. Those roles that we have in families or outside of families, they are callings, but they are not our only ones. That's why I emphasize that we have multiple callings. And so there is dignity and value in anything that God calls us to. But those seasons will usually end. Few callings last for our entire lifetime. Some do. And so if we take our identity in any one of those callings, such as being a mother or father, and then which of course lasts, but then that role shifts as children grow up. That doesn't mean that we don't have other callings. And I think that's the important thing to understand about callings, is that there is not just one, and that way we are not putting all of our identity in one, and then, as you said, kicking up our feet and resting on our laurels when that one's over with.
Yeah. I was so encouraged a few months ago. I was speaking at a church, and an older couple came up to chat with me afterwards. I think they were sort of in their early 70s. And they said that in the last several years, they had started a ministry to prisoners in their city. And I thought, how fabulous, where many people in their kind of mid-60s think, well, I'm retiring, and whether it's I've raised a family, or I've finished a paid work employment period, and now is the time to put up my feet. These guys, as followers of Jesus, were saying, oh no, we have the years that the Lord is giving us beyond that, we're going to use to serve prisoners in Jesus' name. I was like,
I love
that is
that.
absolute life goals. Thinking again, sort of back to some of the New Testament pictures we have and texts that would be especially relevant to this, and this whole idea of service, because I guess there's an extent to which, especially in our modern world, we tend to think of vocation as like about me. Like my vocation, my calling is about my own sort of self-realization, my, me fulfilling my potential, me living my dream, whatever it is. And that actually, from a Christian perspective,
Right.
it's sort of the opposite of that. And I love the moment in Paul's letter to the Colossians where he's talking at that point, especially to people who are living as slaves, and really didn't, they weren't waking up in the morning and thinking, oh, I wonder what I would like to do with my life. They were given tasks that they had to do, probably mostly menial tasks, albeit there's obviously a big range of the kinds of things that people who are legally slaves were doing. And Paul says to Christians living as slaves, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for men, and that actually from Jesus you will receive an inheritance for the work that you're doing. So maybe that's sweeping the floor. Maybe that's going out and buying food for the person you're working for. All these very basic tasks, doing the laundry, whatever it is, that if we're followers of Jesus, we're to see the work that we've been given as an opportunity for serving others and as the kind of overarching category for actually serving Jesus, even if it doesn't look like, even if it looks like something exceedingly basic and unglamorous. I'm curious how that also shapes our thinking about calling if we are followers of Jesus, or if we're kind of curious about what Christianity has to say on this front.
Yeah, and this is why I draw so heavily on the Protestant reformers, because they really emphasized the biblical idea that that God created us to steward creation and to serve one another in the work that we do, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden, even before the fall, that he created us in his image. And because he is a creator and a worker and a gardener and made all the things and cared for all the things, and then when he created man and woman, invited us into that work with him, which gives us an idea of work being good, which is a sharp contrast with a lot of the with other early ancient religions' views of work and the gods and their relationship with humans. And then, God could have continued he could have perpetuated the human race in some way other than requiring the efforts of male and female. He could have provided manna as food for us every day, the way he did for a period in the Old Testament. He could have provided for us any number of ways, but he chose to have humans partake in the provision for one another. And that is why the work that we do to provide food, to build homes, to drive trucks down the road, and to raise children and to teach one another, all of those efforts are examples of what it means to work and uphold the image of God in doing that work. And so the Protestant reformers said vocation is not limited to just simply the ministry inside the church, the sacred realm. Vocation also is in the work that we do outside the church. So they, emphasize the lack of a distinction between sacred and secular in our work, that any vocation that is honoring of God is a holy vocation, whether it's in the church or outside the church. And so that means that we are in our work serving our neighbor. And that's why we have to, again, I keep going back to this, we have to look at where we are, where God has placed us in time and history and geography. I might have med a great shepherdess, thousands of years ago, right? I might have been, and now that there still are shepherds out there in the world, but where I live in America in the 21st century, it's not likely that that's going to be my vocation because of the time and place I live in. So I can pine all I want to have been a shepherdess, but the chances are pretty good that I'm just going to be something that is much more in line with 21st century American culture. And so there is less need for shepherdesses where I live and when I live. And so the same can be true even of things that are more of our time. Something I hit on in the book is, we happen to live in a time, and this world well, where, there are a lot of influencers and writers and podcasters, so many, that we might even say that the market is flooded with them, which actually means that the need maybe isn't so great as it was 10 or 20 years ago. And so that even someone who might be good at it or, have the skills necessary might not make it just because of the economic realities of our time. And so, again, there's so much in flux that the particular gifts that we have, the particular desires and passions that we have, may or may not fill a need in our particular time and place. And if they don't, then we have other ways that we can serve and offer. And that's where we need to keep that discernment process and keep listening for that call to take place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The church that I went to in the sort of 7 years that I was a student, kind of undergrad, master's, PhD, I just stayed in the same place, went to the same college, played for the same soccer team, and went to the same church for 7 years, and it was great. And one of the things that was emphasized to us at that church, and it was the sort of church where there are a lot of people who sort of were doing well academically and maybe thought they were destined for great things. You know, that was sort of the demographic of much of the church. And one of the emphases of that church was to say, hey, rather than sitting around and thinking, what would be glorious for me to do, why don't you look around and think, what's the need?
Mm-hmm.
Like, who needs to be taken care of around here? And how could I serve that? You know, maybe if it's in terms of how you might serve, like in the local body of a church, it's less, oh, well, I think I'm particularly gifted when it comes to singing. And so I would love to be on the stage singing, even though there are, 25 other people who are also great at that. And I really don't feel like I'm called to running the slides or sweeping the floor or, serving in the children's ministry, something that might be kind of less visible. And from a Christian perspective, it's like, well, if there's a need and you can do it, like,
Right.
Can you sweep the floor? Yeah. Can you hold a baby? Sure. Like if there are things that you can do, even if they're not necessarily kind of maximizing your unique and individual gifts, then that might be in fact what you're called to do in that situation, in that season, rather than the thing that, you think would be most fun or most glamorous or even most sort of utilizing of your unique gifts. I think there's something, at least I find incredibly kind of freeing about being a Christian, which is that at the end of the day, if my professional life or yours amounts to nothing, it really doesn't matter.
Right.
Because if Jesus loved you and me enough to die for us, and he has promised us eternity with him, nothing else is going to matter. Like no pitiful achievement that we could have come up with is going to hold a candle to the glory that's going to be revealed when Jesus comes back.
And yet at the same time, he gives us meaning and purpose in all the things that we do, whether they are great or small. And so
right, exactly.
Right. And so it's win-win.
Yes. Yeah. And that some of the most basic things can actually be the most meaningful things, whether it's practicing hospitality, just like inviting people over and cooking a meal, even if you're not a great cook, which I'm not, or whether it's sitting down and reading a story to a child, whether they're your biological child or somebody else's, so that you're able to share that very sort of basic gift of love, or whether it's chatting with an elderly person and hearing some of their life stories and being able to learn from them and recognize them as somebody who still has a kind of contribution to make in the community. There are kind of beautiful things that we can be doing every single day.
One of my favorite stories that I tell in the book is of Jennifer Wiseman, who is an astronaut who works on the Hubble's telescope and just has literally discovered new stars or something. I'm not a scientist. I don't know, but she's basically an astronaut. And I had a conversation with her one time at a conference, and what she was so passionate about and told me what she felt was one of her callings through her whole life had nothing to do with the Hubble telescope or discovering stars and taking pictures of the cosmos, but that she feels called to take care of animals, to make animals happy. And she doesn't even have any pets at this point in her life. She grew up on a farm, but she said if she feels called, if she sees, a caterpillar in the road, to pick it up and put it in a safe place, that is her calling, to care for creation in that way. And how humble and small is that? And yet that's the thing she was so passionate about, that she felt was a calling she has. And that's because of her because she is a Christian who believes in the goodness of God's creation and our role in caring for it, whether it's, working a telescope or taking care of a caterpillar. And that's the kind of meaning and purpose that we can understand when we see the world through the eyes of image bearers of the God who created the world.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, one of my favorite thing about Jennifer Wiseman is that she has the last name Wiseman and that she looks at stars, which, if you're a reader of the Gospels, is like the wise men came from the east, having followed the stars to Jesus. It's like
I wrote about her and never even thought about that. That's hilarious. That's great. I love it.
Nominative determinism. It's like you should either be studying birds or swallowing them one way or another.
Well,
yeah, and I think sometimes sort of figuring out what you're called to do can be a humbling experience. This is a really silly example, but it just comes to mind. When I was a school child, like I was probably 14 or 15, I've always been really bad at swimming. It's one of the few things my husband and I have in common. We're both terrible at swimming. And one time my class, there was going to be like a swimming contest between my class and like the 3 other classes of the same age. And the girl who was organizing the swim team from my class had put out a sort of call saying, hey, we don't have enough people for this particular race. And I said, listen, I'm terrible at swimming, but like I can be a warm body in the pool. Like I'll swim the race. And so I did. And I did so badly. Like I probably, it wasn't even close. I was like so far behind everybody else that I was like last. And afterwards, I remember going up to her and saying, do you want me for the next race? And she was like, no, we found somebody else. And sometimes I think our figuring out what we're called to will kind of look like that. We see a need, we say, I could do that. Like, I'll give it a go. I'm happy. Like, I'm happy to do it, even though it's not necessarily the most aligned with my gifts and skills. And we might well discover in the process, or others around us might discern that we're really not good at that. Like, maybe somebody else is called to that, and that somebody else will see quite how badly we're doing it, and therefore will be motivated to step in and do it instead. I know that's sometimes been my role in life, to do something not as well. My sister-in-law will one day, I think, be a novelist, because she's actually really good at writing. And she has for years been sort of editing other people's work and, working in various ways behind the scenes. And I keep sort of taunting her. I keep saying, you've read my books and you know that you can do better. Like, you and I both know that you can do better. So why didn't you do it? And yeah, sometimes we need the taunt.
Well, and that's why calling really occurs in community, because we live in time and place and in community, and the needs change and our counterparts change. There could be, as you said, someone else who can do something better than you can, and by trying it and failing, that discovery is made not only for you, but for that other person as well. And so we have a role in helping other people find their callings as well. And that's a point I emphasize in the book, is like, we actually need to be proactive in speaking into other people's lives when we see that they are good at something, and that they can do something that maybe that they didn't realize that they could do. I've had that in my own life, and it's made all the difference. And so we should be doing that for others as well, helping them to find their callings by affirming what we see that they can do that they may not even recognize for themselves.
Yeah, and there's actually so much joy to be found in that. I may have told you this before, Karen, but our mutual friend Rachel Gilson, who listeners to the Confronting Christianity podcast may have heard me chat with her before. She won't listen. She never listens to podcasts. But when I first met Rachel and I heard her story of how she became a Christian, and I sort of, in conversation with her, got a sense that she's exceedingly smart, very funny, very good with words, my immediate response was, oh, you actually need to write a book, and you need to be giving talks about Jesus and questions of sexual ethics. And her immediate response was, absolutely not. Like, no way. I'm not doing that. Other people are doing that. And it's, like, this is not what I'm going to be doing. And I had to be like somewhat brutal with her. I mean, she sort of looks back on it as me basically kind of drop kicking her into this kind of ministry because she didn't want to do it. But it actually really was something that she was called to, and I think still is called to. And sometimes, as you say, our role, like part of our calling, is actually going to be helping other people figure out their calling, whether or not it's what they're looking for.
Right. Yes.
Fielding the team. Yeah. When I used to play soccer in England, I sort of managed the defense for the team, which meant me kind of shouting at people a lot, telling them where to go. And I sometimes sort of think about my role in some of my friends' lives a little bit like that, of like, okay, this is where I need you to play. Like, because I can see that you can do this, and this is how, this is how we need to move things forward. Karen, last question for you. So the subtitle of your book, Finding Your Vocation in the True, Good and Beautiful. I'd love to hear your thoughts finally, and for our listeners to hear them, on that beautiful piece. Because I think maybe true and good are kind of more intuitive.
Right.
But what's beautiful about?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, another etymological connection is that the word beautiful, at least in some of its histories, which can be disputed, but is also related to the word call. So beauty in that sense literally calls us, it draws us. And of course, we know as Christians that God is himself beautiful. He's the source of the beautiful, and the classical understanding, both in the church and even before the church, is that beauty draws us to this itself. It is something that is transcendent, something that is outside of ourselves, and something that we are attracted to and drawn to, and not just beautiful people, although that's included, but the beauty of nature and art and music. And it pulls us outside of ourselves. And even though our sense of the beautiful is distorted and fallen, and even though and corrupted in many ways, we still were created to love beauty, to be drawn by it, to be drawn to its source. And so what I try to do in the book is explain how, I basically cite Aquinas and his famous 3 properties of the beautiful, which are integrity, proportion, and luminosity. You can think about a painting and think how a great masterpiece would exhibit those 3 qualities. And think about how in our ordinary everyday work, we are cultivating and creating beauty if we are approaching that work in the entirety of our lives with correct proportionality, with integrity, and if we are bringing illumination to the world and to others through our work, whether that's balancing a checkbook or making a spreadsheet or some kind of a coding. I did a podcast talking with tech people who do coding, and they actually said how their codes need to be like simple and clear and elegant in order to be good. And so if you're homemaking or speaking or preaching, so much of the kind of work that we do can be and should be illuminating, to bring light into the world. And that is a way of pursuing and bringing beauty into the world through our work, through our callings. And the ways we can do that are infinite. And I think if we put that before us, we will find some of that meaning and purpose in even our ordinary work that perhaps, has escaped us until now. So if we're pursuing the beautiful in our work, then we are doing what we were called to do.
Oh, how interesting. A fun fact, I'm working on a book at the moment where one chapter is looking at how Christianity is the foundation for women's rights. And one of the things I've been reflecting on is how in the New Testament, there are 0 references to women's physical looks as like a thing that should be, in a sort of positive sense of like something to aspire to. There's like, maybe one warning about not overemphasizing your appearance versus your sort of inner appearance as a woman. And there's one time a woman in the New Testament is referred to as beautiful, and that is when the woman who's disclosed as being Mary of Bethany pours expensive ointment on Jesus' feet. And when Jesus is defending her, he says, she has done a beautiful thing for me. And it's nothing to do with like how she looks physically. We have no record of how really any of the women who we meet in the New Testament look physically. We have no record of how Jesus looked physically, or like any, you know, there's almost zero emphasis on what we immediately think of when we think of beauty in general, and especially when we think of beauty when it comes to women. But there's an emphasis instead on beautiful actions and living a beautiful life versus sort of trying to cultivate a particular conception of externalized attractiveness that you know carries currency in your particular kind of cultural context. Which is not to say, you know, it's something bad about physical beauty, but that from a Christian perspective, there's something sort of so much richer and deeper about this whole concept of beauty than what we might immediately think about.
Right. Spiritual and moral beauty. And so many of the words, even in the Old Testament, when that talk about goodness are also mean beauty, like that they were not separate. Moral goodness and aesthetic beauty were essentially the same thing, according, and I cite one scholar who talks about that in my chapter on beauty, that you are, in God's economy, something cannot be aesthetically pleasing without also being morally good, and vice versa.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Karen. You guys can grab a copy of Karen's book, You Have a Calling, Finding Your Vocation in the True, Good and Beautiful, online, anywhere, or in a physical bookshop, anywhere you would buy your books. You guys have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can follow us on X or Instagram. You can subscribe to receive newsletters by going to RebeccaMcLaughlin.org. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, very excitingly, new and fresh, if you feel so inclined. And between now and the next time I speak into your earphones, or you see me and the face of a friend of mine talking on a screen, I hope that you have a week where you think deeply about what you're called to do, not just on the large canvas of your entire life, but what you might be called to do today, this week, this month, this year. And if you're a follower of Jesus, that it would be something that brings glory to Jesus rather than primarily to yourself. And if you're not a follower of Jesus yet, that you would seek your purpose and your meaning and your vocation in finally coming face to face with the Son of God, who loved you so much that he died for you.